Hello everyone, thanks for coming. Okay, so we're here together and I'm glad that you're here. This is episode number 9 in the audio book on More Than Laissez-Faire. Today is going to be very exciting, like they all are, but this one's about capital and law, so it should be quite interesting. I'm going to have you think about that for 1 second. We're going to be speaking about capital, I'm going to be speaking about law, and how everything is connected in between. So that's what we're going to do today. Oh boy, I made a mistake. Okay. Shoot. I want to welcome you to this Divine Economy Theory fireside and to thank you for taking your time to be here with me. I know that your time is very precious. This Facebook Live series serves as an audiobook and as an archival resource, since I am the author and originator of the Divine Economy Theory, and I am the one reading the book. This Facebook Live series is also a love story. It is a story about the love of the Divine Economy Theory, the love of freedom, the love of peace and prosperity, and the love of voluntary social cooperation. Let's get started. Today's fireside is Chapter 4, Part 3. The title of Chapter 4 is Real-World Economic Principles. This is a fascinating chapter for many reasons. It places all economic concepts and principles into the model, and it uses production possibility frontiers to visually show how that concept works in the economy. I broke this chapter up into 4 episodes. Please put your questions in the chat box or email me. Let's see if anyone's here. Okay, so one of the things we want to look at here is checking out the Facebook page to see if anybody's here, and also want to show you here along here. There's a description on this page here that tells you about the the different principles and concepts we're going to be covering. Also lists ways to link to different things. There's a link to the More Than Laissez-Faire on Amazon. There's a link to a way of getting notified when the Facebook Live goes live. There's a link to a free workbook PDF that accompanies the diagrams in the book. There's a link to my YouTube channel. There's also, I just added this, there's a link to a podcast that's titled Divine Economy Theory and Austrian Economics. Now there's also then 2 email addresses that you can contact me if you are interested in doing that. So one of the things that I want to talk about now is the big picture. These are the quadrants in the Divine Economy Theory and the Divine Economy model, and we've covered the bottom right, the upper right, and now we're in the upper left, which is the transformation law quadrant. And so the concepts that we're going to be covering in Chapter 4 in this quadrant, the real world economic principles that we'll be looking at is willingness to work, leisure, productivity, comparative advantage, capital goods and capital, capital theory, capital structure spectrum, capital in conceptual time and in historical time. And these are part of chapter 4 in the book called Than Laissez-Faire. So what we'll do now is we will start and go to the audio books. So let's see how that works. Okay, so we're about to begin. This is the part 3 of chapter 4. Real-world economic principles in the transformation law quadrant. I have chosen 8 economic principles for placement in this quadrant. These 8 principles demonstrate reciprocal action within the continuum bounded on one side by capital and on the other by property rights. This is a fascinating quadrant since it attempts to bridge the role of capital as it transmutes and transforms with the non-transmutable nature of the law of human rights. See diagram 4K. So we'll look at the highlights on that paragraph. So again, this is the transformation law quadrant, and there's 8 economic principles. And one of the things that you're going to find in this quadrant is that the attempt to bridge the role of capital and the law of human rights. And so we'll look at diagram 4K, which is right here. And so here we are, we have this quadrant, and it's bound by transformation and law. And then there are all the economic principles and concepts that have characteristics that transformation and law are part of those characteristics that they have. So these are the economic principles that are in the transformation law quadrant. So the first of those principles is willingness to work. If we assume there is no coercion, then the first order of incentive for the human being is to meet one's own needs. Since it is possible to meet one's own needs by taking action, that is what is done. What we acquire from our labor, we are able to keep, presumably. It can be deduced that this basic property right is necessary and sufficient to make a person willing to work. So our first concept, these are the highlights for that. The first concept in the quadrant is willingness to work. And so the first order of incentive to do that, to have this willingness, is because each human being wants to meet their own needs. And so that is done by taking action. And so what we acquire from our labor, we are able to keep. And it's this basic property right which is necessary and sufficient to make a person willing to work. A negative corollary to is that without the right to receive the fruits of one's labor, there would be an unwillingness to work. Nothing destroys the willingness to work faster than removing the human right to reap what you sow. So there's a negative corollary here. We're talking about a concept, a principle that's basic, and then there's the negative of it. And that is, if without the right to receive the fruits of one's labor, there's an unwillingness to work. So I think we're ready to move to the next concept and principle in this quadrant. And here, so again, here's the picture of the quadrant, and these are the concepts that are in that quadrant. So we're moving to the next one, which is leisure. Leisure is having the time to appreciate any wealth above basic subsistence. Leisure describes the circumstances that exist once all vital needs are met, and a choice is then made to refrain from work to pursue something more pleasurable. Consider the significance of leisure. Not only does the transformation of labor into property give an incentive to work, but acquisition of even a rudimentary property right, here given as time to rest, gives one the right to make choices. As soon as there are choices, there is the potential for leisure, for division of labor, for active entrepreneurship, and for the emergence of capital. So here we go. We're going into this next section. This is the highlights of this first paragraph in the next section on leisure. Leisure is having the time to appreciate any wealth above basic subsistence. Once there's choices because of that, you can refrain from work to pursue something more pleasurable. And that's what leisure is, and let's consider the significance of leisure. As soon as there are choices, there is the potential for leisure, and some of the other things that could be done, which is the division of labor, active entrepreneurship, and the emergence of capital. So what I'd like you to do now is spend a moment reflecting on what we've talked about so far. Do you have any thoughts about what we've talked about? Okay, so we're going to move into the next concept. And the next concept is productivity. The more productive one is, the more property rights one acquires. The more property rights one has, the more choices there are, which further cascades into more loci for entrepreneurial action and more diverse types of capital investments. So we'll look at the highlights of this next section, which is productivity. The more productive one is, the more property rights one acquires. And once there's more property rights, then there's more choices. And that further cascades into opportunities for entrepreneurial action or more diverse types of capital investments. So technological innovation springs from these diverse types of capital investments. Guess what? All of these lead to increased productivity. Productivity, then, is an expression of individual initiative, and it leads to increased real wages. We'll take a look at that paragraph. So, technological innovation springs from these diverse types of capital investments. And all of these lead to increased productivity. And productivity leads to increased real wages. Operating within this milieu is productive is the productive actions of businessmen and the users of capital, and it is their actions that generate profits. A portion of these profits then goes towards new capital in the form of wages and factor incomes. Businessmen and women and the users of capital play a guiding role, as stated by Mises. What produces the product are not toil and trouble in themselves, but the fact that the toiling is guided by reason. The human mind alone has the power to remove uneasiness. This advancing productivity is thoroughly described by Reisman. The precise nature of the work of businessmen and capitalists needs to be explained. In essence, it is to raise the productivity and thus the real wages of manual labor by means of creating, coordinating, and improving the efficiency of the division of labor. So we'll look at the highlights for this paragraph. So it's the users of capital and business people who it's their actions that generate profits. And a portion of these profits then go towards new capital in the form of wages and factor incomes. And it's these businessmen and women and the users of capital that play a guiding role. And their toiling is guided by reason. And it advances productivity. It's this precise nature of this that we need to understand. The precise nature of the work done by business people and capitalists. And that is, it's to raise productivity. And this is done by creating and coordinating and improving the efficiency of division of labor. The cascading continues. If I am more productive, then my real wage will increase, which translates into more savings provided the future is perceived as hopeful. This will create new capital, which will be used to increase productivity. Okay, we're seeing how all these things are building on one another. Okay, so this cascading continues. Because of the increased productivity, the real wage will increase, which at some point will translate into more savings, provided the future is perceived as hopeful. And this more savings will create new capital, which then in turn leads to increased productivity. And increased productivity can be defined as more consumer goods per productive unit. As the supply of goods increases, the price of those goods decreases, which means an increase in the standard of living in real terms. What can be discerned from this is that property rights, which underlie productivity, serve as the foundation for development. Once the connection between property rights and productivity is understood, a new work ethic will emerge. So, how do you define productivity? It's defined as more consumer goods per productive unit. And so as goods, the supply of goods increases, the prices of the goods decreases, which translates into an increased standard of living in real terms. And what can really be grasped and understood from this whole process, this cascading process, is that property rights, which underlie productivity, serves as the foundation for development. And once the connection between property rights and productivity is understood, a new work ethic will emerge. So what I would like you to do for a minute here is reflect on what I've been saying here and what we've been learning from this book called Than Laissez-Faire. And just think about what we've just talked about for a minute or two, please. So we're about then to go to the next principle and concept, and that one is comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is a derivation of the concept of relativity. Regardless of absolute advantage, every person or geographic unit has a comparative advantage with regards some good or service relative to their trading partners. Trade occurs only if both sides benefit, implying that there is a double inequality in exchange. Both trade partners value what they get more than what they trade away. So we'll look at the highlights of that. So we're in this next section. The next concept is comparative advantage, and it's a derivation of the concept of relativity. Think about that. Every person or geographic unit has an advantage, a comparative advantage, with regard to some good or service relative to their trading partners. Trade only occurs if both sides benefit. Comparative advantage is also a derivative of the division of labor. Trading partners will divide their labors so that each is producing and trading the good or service that enables both sides to maximize their benefit from trade. This specialization from division of labor, combined with the secondary benefits that come from both trading and from maintaining a base of productive capacity, is what captures the benefits of comparative advantage. So we saw that comparative advantage was a derivation of the concept of relativity. It's also a derivative of the division of labor. Because the trading partners will divide their labors so that they're producing in a way that both sides maximize their benefit from trade. And it's basically a specialization that comes from the division of labor. And there's secondary benefits that are coming also. And that is the benefits that come from trading and the benefits that come from maintaining a base of productive capacity. The resources that are uniquely mine as part of my skill set and my property rights are such that I have a comparative advantage with regard to something relative to my trading partner's skills and property rights. If we engage in trade, the fact that we do trade means that both have gained. Therefore, the gain is in some degree an advancement, which then can be consumed or otherwise used to expand my property rights, possibly into capital goods, either directly or indirectly through savings. To take full advantage of the opportunities that come from trade, which is an exchange, I will specialize in producing the good or service in which I have the relative comparative advantage. So that's how it works. I have a comparative advantage with regards to something relative to my trading partners. Assuming we're engaging in trade, that means we're both gaining. And then what's happening is I'm specializing in producing the good or service in which I have a relative advantage. That's what enables us both to gain from trade. So we're going to move to the next section, capital goods and capital. These are intermediate goods or producer goods, which make it possible for consumer goods and services to be made more readily available and or of higher quality. Capital goods initially require the use of capital to pay those making or using the capital goods until there is a flow of income from the end of the line consumer good or service. It is easy to see that capital structurally exists in different stages of development. Some capital goods are already completed and are producing goods. Other capital is tied up in capital goods, which are still not completed and are still not producing goods. So we're going to go into this next section, this other new economic concept and principle that goes into that transformation law quadrant, and it's capital goods and capital. Capital goods are intermediate goods or producer goods, and it makes it possible for consumer goods to be made more and services to be made more readily available or of higher quality. Capital goods initially require the use of capital to pay those who are making or using the capital goods until there is a flow of income from the end of the line consumer good or service. So capital structurally exists in different stages of development. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. But right now what I'd like to do is come back to here and greet you. Thank you for coming. Talk to you about the episode number 9, which is talking about transformation law quadrant, and speaking more specifically about capital goods and property rights or laws. And so I'm hoping that you're enjoying this. I'm going to take a sip from my Ludwig von Mises coffee mug. So we paused a couple times for you to reflect on some of the points that were made. I didn't know if you had any comments about that, but there's some interesting points that were made, like what it would take to have a new work ethic become common among people, and that is basically to understand that property rights are essential for productivity. For productivity to improve, then property rights need to be more refined and better defined. So we're going to go now back to the audio book, and so thanks for coming. So now we're on the second paragraph of this concept of capital goods and capital. Capital is a loan of the fruits of past labor. The users of capital, capitalists, pay for the factors needed either as wages or as factor incomes to factors other than labor, as part of the production process. These wages and factor incomes are costs to the capitalists. So capital is basically a loan of the fruits of past labor, and the users of capital pay for the factors needed, and that's either so basically wages and factor incomes are costs to the capitalists. If the returns to capital are greater than the costs of capital, then the capital value increases. Additionally, if new or free capital becomes available, it is alertly used since capital is the most limiting factor in the economy. Capital originates from loanable funds, that is, from savings. Just as economic growth is limited by capital, consumption is limited by production. Notice the sequence for an advancing economy. Savings, then capital, then production of goods and services for consumption. So here are the highlights for that paragraph. That if the returns to the capital are greater than the costs, then the capital value increases. And when there's new or free capital, it's alertly used since capital is the most limiting factor in the economy. Capital originates from loanable funds. And just as economic growth is limited by capital, then consumption is limited by production. So now you can get a feel for the sequence for an advancing economy. Savings, then capital, then production of goods and services for consumption. Something that has to be addressed. There is a severe prejudice towards the word capitalist. The historical reason for this prejudice is outside the scope of this book. In the divine economy, the capitalist is seen as a real and vital agent of the economy, just like time is a vital element, or entrepreneurs are vital agents, or just like property rights are considered as vital. We'll look at that paragraph. So the highlights is there is common, very common out there, a prejudice, a severe prejudice towards the word capitalist. But in the divine economy, and basically in reality, a capitalist is a real and vital agent of the economy, just like time is a vital element, and entrepreneurs are vital agents, and property rights are vital. This book makes it clear repeatedly that there is a great deal of ignorance about economics, and so there are many prejudices to be overcome. Mises broadens the view when addressing productive capital. Production is not something physical, material, and external. It is a spiritual and intellectual phenomenon. Its essential requisites are not human labor and external natural forces and things, but the decision of the mind to use these factors as means for the attainment of ends. So we'll look at this paragraph. These are the highlights. There's a great deal of ignorance about economics, and there's many prejudices to be overcome. Mises helps by making this statement. Production is not something physical, material, and external. It is a spiritual and intellectual phenomenon. It's the decision of the mind to use these factors as means for the attainment of ends. So education is a type of capital. Education is necessary for remedying the problems of economic prejudice and ignorance. The education that is necessary for remedying the problems of economic prejudice and ignorance will not come from institutions that are funded by the interventionists. This book is one of the ways to gain clarity about economics, independent of contemporary prejudices. So this highlights for this paragraph is that education is a type of capital, and that this book is one of the ways to gain clarity about economics, independent of contemporary prejudices. So next we'll look at capital theory. Of all the factors in the economy, capital is the most limiting. Why? Look back at the sections about loanable funds and time preference. People strongly prefer things in the present. Therefore, even under the most peaceful conditions, only a small proportion of their incomes will be saved. Whereas the other half of the loanable funds market is the demand for loanable funds. And that is a function of what can be described as an intense and determined search for capital in the market. So we're going to look at the next economic concept and principle in this quadrant, the quadrant of transformation and law. And so, capital is the most limiting factor in the economy. People strongly prefer things in the present. So even under the most peaceful conditions, only a small proportion of their incomes is saved. Whereas the demand for loanable funds is intense and determined. There's an intense and determined search for capital in the market. And so that demand for loanable funds is always present and very dominant. And so the supply of loanable funds is always gobbled up quickly. Capital is the most limiting factor in the economy because it is constrained by loanable funds. The economy is also limited by capital since capital is the transformational element of the economy, which of course would make it highly sought after. Remember the earlier discussion about the efficiency gain that comes from the division of labor. Well, it is capital that yields a cumulative and collective efficiency gain for the economy that dwarfs all of the other economic factors. Capital is the key to progress. So we know that capital is constrained by loanable funds, and yet it is so sought after intensely because it's the transformational element of the economy. And what it is capital is what yields a cumulative and collective efficiency gain for the economy. And it does that to such a magnitude that all other economic factors are dwarfed by it. And that's why capital is the key to progress. Once the primitive economy moved beyond individuals being self-sufficient but barely subsistent, capital became the means of payment to labor and other factors used in the production of goods. In reality, there is no rivalry between labor and capital except in the fictional model of the world imagined by Marx and those who are like-minded, where capital is selectively excluded from the economy. Labor is intimately and ultimately the beneficiary of capital, just as are the owners of other factors of production. So we'll look closely at that paragraph. It says that when the economy was primitive, once it moved beyond that point, then capital became the means of payment for all the factors, labor and other factors. And so there's no rivalry between labor and capital, because labor is intimately and ultimately the beneficiary of capital, just as are the owners of other factors of production. Let us consider the economically relevant subject of the formation of capital. Here, disutility of labor is a motivating element, as is time preference, which determines the level of savings. Refer to the interactive three-way diagram in diagram 4L. Division of labor, a specialization that is an expression of human diversity, creates in the market loci for arbitrage and profit opportunities. This quickly draws the attention of alert entrepreneurs. Savings are then used as capital by the entrepreneurs to pay the wages and factor incomes until the time when revenues can. Sales revenue minus the money costs, wages and factor incomes, eventually yield a profit or a loss, and some of the net income then re-enters as loanable funds, that is, as new capital. Entrepreneurial alertness also contributes to the identification of ways to specialize, combining with capital to augment the division of labor. See diagram 4L. So here's diagram 4L. It's called the interactive three-way relationship between capital, division of labor, and arbitrage and profit or loss. So we'll look at this paragraph, at the highlights of it. So what we have is once there's formation of capital, this disutility of labor and time preference, that's what leads to the formation of capital, because that's also what leads to savings. So we have this division of labor, and that's creating a location in the market for opportunities of arbitrage and profit. And that draws the attention of alert entrepreneurs. And then savings is used as capital by these entrepreneurs to pay wages and factor incomes. And then what happens then was we have this revenue that's coming from this sales, and there's the money costs related to the wages and incomes, factor incomes, and that is what yields either a profit or a loss. We're assuming here that there's a profit which then re-enters as new capital, and then that is what enables these entrepreneurs to identify ways to specialize. They now have this new capital, they have information about profit and loss, they have information about what the arbitrage and profit opportunities, and then that specialization is then, and using that capital in that way then augments the division of labor. So we have, here's this diagram of the interactive three-way relationship. You have division of labor that can happen because of the existence of capital, and it also leads to the formation of capital. So when it operates in this cycle here, this division of labor and specialization that comes from that leads to a profit opportunity. The profits then contribute then to capital, and capital is what enables the augmentation of the division of labor. So this interactive, going both directions between these elements in the economy, it's a constant interaction, a constant flow back and forth. There's harmony, there's reciprocity in this process. Another interesting economic benefit from capital is the actual generation of information about both revenues and costs as a result of the application of capital in the economy. It is the involvement in the economy by capitalists that creates wages and factor prices. These are their costs, and sales revenues. These wages and factor prices serve as a source of information, enabling entrepreneurs and capitalists to calculate so they can make rational decisions. If we assume these decisions are from the market signals in a divine economy, in other words, in an unhampered, free market, laissez-faire economy, they are fully compatible with the divine concepts of unity and justice. So we'll look at that paragraph. See the highlights. So another feature of this, of capital, some of the benefits that come from it is it generates information about revenues and costs. And involvement in the economy by capitalists is what's creating wages and factor prices and sales revenues. And this is a source of information then that enables entrepreneurs and capitalists to calculate so they can make rational decisions. And these are the signals that are evident and manifest in the market. And if they're not interfered with, if it's just these signals, then they're fully compatible with the concepts of unity and justice. Okay, so in a Crusoe situation, there's one person isolated on an island. The initial payment for his initial work, his wage, equals his profit. He works by climbing a coconut tree and he eats the coconut. That's his profit. At that point, the wage-profit ratio is equal to 1. Once there is an opportunity to specialize, trading with others in a market, and there is savings, capital enters into the scenario, which potentially generates wages and factor incomes. To see how capital benefits labor, refer to diagram 4M. Notice the intricacies that make up the economic definition of an ever-advancing economy. So here's diagram 4M, and the title of it is Capital Benefits Labor. Okay, so we have the initial situation where Crusoe is on an island by himself. He goes, the wage of his effort, he gets the coconut, and that's his profit. They're identical. So the wage to profit ratio is 1. And then what happens over time is now he finds that there's other people on the island and they can trade. And so all of a sudden we've got division of labor, one specializing in one thing, one specializing other in trading. And so then there's opportunity for savings. Then the savings is used to form capital. And so then it starts this motion, this movement, this development of an ever-advancing economy from there on, where there's capital, and then there's more capital, and there's capitalists, and there's entrepreneurship, and there's productivity increases. And over time, what that means is that because of the specialization and the competition for scarce labor, wages increase, profits decrease over time. So this wage rate down at the bottom, if you look, initially it's at 1, the wage to profit ratio. But then because of the pressures and the tendencies over time, because of increased productivity, the wage profit ratio becomes greater than 1. And so the labor benefits from capital is the point there. So we're going to go to the highlights for this paragraph. In a Crusoe situation, we have one person isolated on the island, and the wage to profit ratio is equal to 1. But once that changes, and there's an opportunity to specialize because there's trading with others in a market, there's savings because of the specialization, and then capital enters, which potentially generates wages and factor incomes. And so capital is basically benefits labor, and you can see this in this diagram, which is a diagram showing an ever-advancing economy. So you can look down here at the wage to profit ratio over time. At Crusoe, one person on an island, the wage was the profit, and so that's 1. That ratio is 1. But over time, because of the pressures from competing for scarce labor, increased productivity because of division of labor, and more capital that's enabling this more specialization, and then more capitalists seeking out those opportunities. All those things, the tendency is the profit margins are decreasing and the wage rates are increasing. And so that's where capital is benefiting labor. You can see in this pattern of activity over time. If there are profits, then that will end up creating new savings. And new savings means more capital, which attracts those seeking capital. As the number of capitalists increases, wages and factor incomes increase because there is competition for these scarce resources, which puts upward pressure on the wages and factor prices. So let's look at this. We're going to look at some of the pressures and tendencies. If there are profits, that will lead to new savings, which means more capital, and then that will attract a larger number of capitalists, which will put upward pressure on wages and factor incomes because of this competition for these scarce resources. So division of labor at the early stages of which was near Crusoe, was crude, but as it is directed by businessmen and capitalists, the division of labor becomes more refined. The process continues. Generation of wealth not only brings more capitalists to the market, but it also leads to an expansion of the use of capital to more productive, temporally remote production processes. So let's look at the highlights on that paragraph. So this division of labor becomes directed over time by business people and capitalists, and so it becomes more and more refined. And this process is continual. It just continues. And then the generation of wealth, not only does it bring more capitalists in the market, but it also leads to the use of capital in more productive, temporally remote production processes. So there's more and more reasons why the economy progresses, because you have the expansion of the increase of division of labor, because of specialization, because of capital, the increased productivity that comes from that, and also it enables entrepreneurs and capitalists to go into fields, into production, where the final fruits of that production are more and more remote from the present because of the capital. And those are usually more productive type processes. As the number of capitalists increase, the profits tend to decrease, which with each getting a smaller portion, independent of the wages and factor incomes paid out during production. In other words, wages and factor incomes tend to increase while profits tend to decrease. Additionally, every innovation and improvement that comes from this process ultimately reaches the consumers, who benefit from both better products and lower prices brought about by innovation. In summary, the wage to profit ratio increases as civilization advances. So we'll look at the highlights on this paragraph. So as the number of capitalists increases, profits tend to decrease, with each capitalist entrepreneur getting a smaller portion. Wages and factor incomes tend to increase, while profits tend to decrease. And in addition to that, what happens is every innovation and improvement that comes as a result of this increased productivity reaches the consumers, and they benefit both from better products and lower prices brought about by the innovation. And so what we find is that the wage to profit ratio increases as civilization advances. There is a tendency toward a uniform rate of return on capital on all capital invested, which closely approximates the pure rate of interest. Mises makes a similar observation. The history of mankind is the record of a progressive intensification of the division of labor. The operation of the principle of the division of labor and its corollary, cooperation, tends ultimately toward a world-embracing system of production. So let's look at the highlights for that paragraph. There's a tendency, because of this process that's taking place and accompanying this advancing of civilization, there's a tendency towards a uniform rate of return. The history of mankind is a record of progressive intensification of the division of labor and its corollary. Now, the corollary of this intensification of the division of labor is cooperation, and this advancement of the economy, an ever-advancing civilization, and the history of mankind is towards a world-embracing system of production. Business cycles do not occur in the divine economy since none of the signals in the market are distorted. The market interest rate truly reflects the amount of savings that people have, creating a balance throughout the capital structure between the present and the future. When an artificial interest rate is created by the deceitful practices associated with fiat currencies, the entrepreneurs allocate capital incorrectly in both the amount invested and the capital invested temporally across the time horizon, which leads to a business cycle. So business cycles do not occur in the divine economy because the market rates truly reflect the amount of savings that people have, and that creates a balance throughout the capital structure. But when there's artificial interest rates because of deceitful practices associated with the fiat currencies, the entrepreneurs end up allocating capital incorrectly, and that leads to a business cycle. If we make an assumption that there is only a single act of intervention, then all the malinvestments will be purged by the divine economy during the passage of one business cycle. But since resources are allocated across a span of time and across a span of capital structure, a business cycle is not merely something that happens at a specific point in time. The negative consequences manifest themselves over many time periods, or until all malinvestments are purged for the duration of that cycle. So the business cycle is not merely something that happens at one specific point in time, and all those malinvestments to be purged, it has to go through many time periods and to get it all cleared out of the system because of the heterogeneous capital structure. If consumer credit is extended in the market artificially, which means that it is unmatched by existing savings, capital is consumed. What is happening is that consumption is in excess of the productive capacity. Productive capacity in the economy is supported by the level of savings and the subsequent capital. The only way to now consume more is to use current savings, which was to serve as the loanable funds for new capital and economic growth. This is the equivalent of consuming capital, which consequently will cause the economy to regress, the typical consequence of intervention. So if consumer credit is extended artificially, capital is consumed, because consumption in excess of the production, what's happening is then when that happens is that consumption is in excess of the productive capacity. And current savings is used, which was supposed to serve as loanable funds for new capital and economic growth. As a result, the economy will regress. The important point here, the important point to note here is that the divine economy heals itself and cannot be destroyed. All disruption and disorder in the economy comes from corruption caused by human intervention. Equilibrating forces begin to clear these afflictions almost immediately after intervention is halted. Rest assured that the power of the divine economy is indestructible and self-healing. Okay, the divine economy heals itself and cannot be destroyed. There is corruption that is caused by human intervention, but the equilibrating forces will clear it away as soon as the intervention is halted. And so that's the power of the economy. So we're about to go into the next section, but before we do that, I want to come back here and speak with you. I'm glad you're here, and I'm hoping that you're enjoying this. I'm sure there's some new things that you haven't thought of before, and mostly I'm here because my throat is terribly dry, and I'm going to get a drink from my Ludwig von Mises mug. We're going to take a second here and go see if anybody has come to the Facebook Live page. I'll check that out. Here. Okay. So we'll come back to and we'll go back to the audiobook. And that's going to right here. So let's see if we're back where we're supposed to be. Not yet. Okay. All right. Capital structure spectrum. That's the next topic, our next principle and concept in this transformation law quadrant. It's called the capital structure spectrum. Production of all types requires capital. Some capital may be needed for a short time, like a day or a week or a month. Other capital needs to suffice production for years. The picture that emerges is a wide array of production, funded for varying lengths of time, all of which makes up the capital structure, funded by savings. So here we are, this next section, capital structure. Production of all types requires capital. So there's an emerging picture of a wide array of production funded for varying lengths of time, and that is the capital structure. And the capital structure is funded by savings. The starting point of an endeavor is very significant. If there is plenty of capital available at the beginning, then the scale of production can be of a greater magnitude. Likewise, if there is plenty of capital, the temporal remoteness from the consumer good can be greater. In other words, there can be more research and development when capital is relatively plenty, which ultimately makes the possible fruits of that endeavor greater. Let's look at the highlights. If there's plenty of capital available, then the scale of production can be of greater magnitude. If there's plenty of capital, the temporal remoteness from the consumer good can be greater because because that capital enables there to be more research and development before the good comes to the market, if there's plenty of capital. The concept of originary interest is closely related to time preference, but it can be used to explain a different aspect of the economy. Originary interest is another of the praxeological laws that describes how humans act. People act in such a way that demonstrates that they value present goods higher than those same goods in the future in relative terms. So we'll look at the highlights for that. Originary interest is a praxeological law, and it describes how humans act. People value present goods higher than those same goods in the future. That represents originary interest. In and of itself, originary interest explains why people take action in the present. Without this conceptual reality operating in the human psyche, there would be no consumption, since there would be no preference for anything now. Humans devoid of originary interest would have no motivation to eat now in the present, which would cause the species to go extinct. Nevertheless, needless to say, human beings do indeed place a high valuation on the present. So, originary interest explains why people take action in the present. Human beings, all human beings, place a high valuation on the present. After considering all these points, it becomes clear that capital structure is really a spectrum. The most immediate end of the spectrum is current consumption, say ice cream about to be selected from the freezer at the store. The more roundabout means of production, those that are temporarily remote from the consumer, are located toward the other end of the spectrum. Capital is heterogeneous and inherent, beginning with consumption goods at the most immediate end and capital of the capital structure spectrum. See diagram 4n. So 4n is the fruits of the capital structure spectrum. You can see it's from now into the future. And the consumption good available at T0, meaning right now, And then there's a consumption good available at T0 plus 1. And there's consumption goods all across the spectrum to finally consumption good available at Tn plus 1. So when you look at this spectrum, the fruits of the capital structure spectrum, you see that there's a consumption good at time now. There's a consumption good available at time now plus 1. And it goes all the way to the consumption good available at time n. Could be infinity plus 1. It wouldn't be infinity in real terms. It could be, let's say, 10 years from now, and then at 11 years from now. Okay, so as you move along there, there's requirement for more roundabout production to get to that point. The capital structure spectrum is a conceptual representation of the various fruits of capital, consumption goods, over time. This idea of one spectrum for all the various forms of, or structures of capital serves as another proof of the inseparability of capital from the consumption choices made to sustain and satisfy life. There is nothing evil about capital. In fact, capital is simply a vital element of the economy. So this capital structure spectrum is a conceptual representation of the various fruits of capital, which are consumption goods, over time. It serves as another proof of the inseparability of capital from the consumption choices made to sustain and satisfy life. There's nothing evil about capital. It's simply a vital element of the economy. So we're about to go to the next section. Capital in conceptual time and in historical time. When there appears to be no time other than the present, that was like originary interest. The originary interest tells us that all consumption would be immediate. There would be no savings. When the time horizon expands to t plus 1, the originary interest tells us that priority is given to the present time, but that a pool of funding will begin to form unless, that is, the economy is in a primitive condition of basic subsistence. Of course, the concept of time implies that there is a future. Thus, conceptual time shows that capital inevitably forms. We'll look at the highlights for that. We're in this new concept and principles section in chapter 4. And this says that just understanding originary interest tells you that all consumption would be immediate if there was no time other than the present, and there would be no savings. But once there's a time horizon that's understood to be real beyond the present, then a pool of funding will begin to form. And that's what will lead to formation of capital. So conceptual time shows that capital inevitably forms. When the economy began in its simplest form, which let's say occurred at t equals 0, the effort made just for survival meant that the gain or the profit was equivalent to the compensation for the labor, the wage. In other words, the hunger was satisfied or the thirst was quenched. As the economy evolved, t plus 1, and progressed past subsistence due to the development of division of labor, capital became available to pay wages and factor incomes, money costs, and the capital structure formed. Then the revenues minus cost information brought about the ability to calculate, which then enabled entrepreneurs to drive the economy forward. Historical time shows that capital emerges and serves to continually increase the wage to profit ratio. Notably, labor and productive factors are the beneficiaries of capital. So we'll look at the highlights for that. So when the economy first begins, it's just survival. Hunger is needing satisfied, thirst is needing quenched. But once the economy evolves, then what you have is you have some savings forming. And so that's where you have capital taking place, capital structure being built, and that's when it's formed, once there's savings. And then as a result of that, there's information generated because of the revenues minus costs ability that came about because of savings and capital and division of labor. So with that, there's then the ability to calculate, and that enables entrepreneurs to drive the economy forward. So now what we have is this historical time, and that shows that capital emerges. That labor and productive factors are the beneficiaries of capital. So we're going to now go to the example, the transformation law quadrant example, which is comparative advantage. Comparative advantage operates in a human society because human beings are complex and they have a plethora of needs and wants. To some extent, geographic distances act as a limitation. Since there are numerous trading partners with a great diversity of special skills and talents, all of whom also have a great number of needs, the law of comparative advantage operates without fail. So we already talked about this at the beginning when we introduced this concept, but we're now going to look at it as a specific example. That once there's trading partners, then there's a great opportunity for great diversity of special skills and talents. And those same people who have those talents also have a great number of needs. And so what happens is the law of comparative advantage operates without fail. And so we'll move to the next paragraph, which is this one here. This law can be violated, causing great harm to all, and especially to those whose alternatives are most limited. One example of intervention that does this type of damage is any kind of trade barrier, for example, tariffs. A regional, simple economy may need to have free access to markets for their comparative advantage to be realized. Tariffs may destroy the feasibility of its comparative advantage, depriving this simple regional economy of the ability to transform itself. Without such interference, the law of comparative advantage would activate all the agents of prosperity: division of labor, then trade, and possibly savings, capital, and entrepreneurship. That is, if we assume that property rights exist. So we'll look at that paragraph. There is a way, we see it all the time. This law, this concept, this principle of comparative advantage can be violated, and it does great harm, especially to those whose alternatives are most limited. But if there's no interference with this law, then it will activate the agents of prosperity, which are division of labor, trade, savings, capital, and entrepreneurship, and provided property rights exist. So now we're going to look at the next section, which is transformation law quadrant production possibilities frontier example. So the no growth point in this example of comparative advantage is where free trade and division of labor are offset, negated by trade barriers. See diagram 4.0. So this is diagram 4.0 is the comparative advantage production possibilities frontier. So we have trade barriers as one aggregate and free trade and division of labor as the other aggregate, and somewhere along this frontier is the no growth point, and that's right there. So we're going to look at the next section, which is the transformation law quadrant production possibilities frontier. And the example we're going to look at is comparative advantage. And where that no growth point is on that frontier is where the free trade and the division of labor, that aggregate, is offset by trade barriers. So if we look at the diagram of the comparative advantage production possibilities frontier, it has a no growth point, and then it has opposing aggregates. One is trade barriers, and the other is free trade and division of labor. As more trade barriers are raised, there is less ability to take advantage of the division of labor. The result is a contracting economy. See diagram 4P. So here's diagram 4P. It's the comparative advantage contracting economy. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at that same information that's been highlighted. So once there's more trade barriers raised, you see the location on the frontier goes north and west. And what that means is there's less ability to take advantage of the division of labor. And as a result, you have a cascading inward, a contracting economy over time. So we've got this next paragraph. Free trade increases the division of labor, which leads to wealth generating specialization and capital formation. In this environment, the economy expands. See diagram 4Q. So here's diagram 4Q, comparative advantage expanding economy. If we have free trade and division of labor increasing. You go from T0 to T1 to T2 because we're on this side of the no growth point, and that's showing where the economy is expanding. So we'll look at that paragraph. Free trade increases division of labor. Okay, so that's going to take you to the beyond. To a condition where there is economic growth, which leads, this increased division of labor leads to wealth generating specialization and capital formation. So we know that those conditions, that environment leads to an expanding economy. So you can see that in diagram 4Q that we have the position on the frontier being south and east of the no growth point, and what happens is over time then, going from T0 to T1 to T2, the economy is expanding because of free trade and division of labor, in contrast to what happens when there's trade barriers. So now look at the final paragraph, final section in this quadrant of transformation law, and that is a summary statement. The divine economy rests firmly on property rights. In contrast, what suffers most in an economy hampered by weak property rights is people's willingness to save and the ability for capital to accumulate. The economy then loses its power to transform. The divine economy has an intricate capital structure which acts as an agent of transformation, leading to economic development. Built into the divine economy are all the incentives that encourage movement towards more choices, and towards the use of capital. So our summary for this quadrant, the transformation law quadrant, is that the economy rests firmly on property rights, and a willingness to save and the ability for capital to accumulate is one of the requirements for the economy to grow. And the divine economy has this intricate capital structure, and it's that capital structure which acts as an agent of transformation. And then in the divine economy itself, the incentives are such as movement as far as understanding the economy moves forward when there's towards more choices and towards the use of capital, because the incentives are in place to do that. So we'll now get close to finishing here. We have two selected exercises. We have the first one, and that we'll look at the highlights on that. So what you're asked to do is to find the no growth points for each of the 8 principles. And then this is a little bit of a different kind of an exercise, to set them up in verbal simultaneous equations in that kind of a format. So you can look across the equations and see what are the concepts and principles that lead to an expanding economy. And so you lay those out, and they're all common to having an expanding economy. So you have this concept and this concept leads to the expanding economy. That's the equation that you use. And when you do that for each of the concepts, then you will have a really good view of what it would take, what circumstances need to be in place to have an expanding economy. And then the exercise this exercise number 2 is to look at all these equations, look at all these concepts, and see how that is an expression of a non-interventionist policy, and that will help you kind of formulate what a non-interventionist policy would look like. So we're going to go back now to the agenda, and so you had a few chances to reflect, and I went through some of the highlighted paragraphs, and that probably brought some other points to the surface for you to think about. And so what we want to do is apply economics to our lives right now. So one of the ways to do that is to reflect on it, and then see if there's some action that you can take, because it's this reflection and action which is the process of transformation. It'll transform you, and then as you apply it, it'll transform your surroundings and the economy around you. So this is what the goal is to use the knowledge of economics, which shows how everything is interconnected, and to use the knowledge of economics then to transform the world around you. So that's what I'm hoping that you get from the audiobook that I just presented, this episode number 9 of the More Than Laissez-Faire audiobook. And you may have picked it up already that I'm having a little little difficult time staying sharp. I didn't get enough sleep last night, apparently, because I'm reading through this and I'm not sharp on all the points. So I'm hoping that you got something from this, and that you'll enough of it was interesting to you to buy the book, More Than Laissez-Faire, and then you can dig into it deeply. Otherwise, this audiobook will hopefully bring home some points for you and make you more interested in economics and in divine economy theory. There's a lot of great content here, and so I hopefully that you've enjoyed this. And so I'm going to again thank you for coming, and look forward to you coming to the next time. I'll do my best to remember to take a nap or something beforehand, so I'm fully engaged. And so I will talk to you next time. Thank you.